We'll behave from now on.
Hello, hello.
Hi.
Hi, Daniel.
Just getting my computer set up. Can you guys hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Awesome. How's it going, Fede? Hey, Larissa.
Good to see you, Dan. Hi.
You too.
Very well, thank you for having me.
Yeah. There's Jesse. Hey, Michael.
Hey, everybody.
We're gonna get started at 5 past the hour. Give some people a few minutes to jump in.
Okay. Hey, Jen.
Yeah.
Ciao, Fede. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Hi.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks so much for putting this event together.
Yeah, thanks for joining.
And Jesse and Michael, it's very nice to meet you.
You too, Fede. Nice to meet you.
Where's everybody connecting from?
I'm currently in Chicago.
I'm in Berkeley.
Oh,
San
nice.
Francisco.
We're in the process of moving to Berkeley.
That's right. That's exciting. Do you know when the official move is going
Found
to
a
be?
house.
We don't know yet. Still looking for a place.
Tough time to move.
Yeah. We're currently in Tahoe and we're literally buried in snow. I haven't seen so much snow in a long time.
That's good. Good slopes.
Yeah.
Fede, you said you're in Tahoe right now?
Mm-hmm.
Nice. I'll be there this weekend.
Oh, cool. Yeah, it looks like it's gonna be a really good weekend to be here.
Yeah. Yeah. Sounds like it's getting quite a snowstorm the next couple of days. Michael, I like the official logo background. I gotta get something nice like that for myself.
Hey, man. Always glad to be representing.
One of the portfolio companies we talk to, every time we talk to them, they have a different molecule in the background that they've been producing.
Yeah.
Like a close-up picture of the LSD crystals or some other crystals they've been manufacturing.
That's
I
awesome.
think that's a pretty good one.
Get started in a couple minutes. while we're waiting, I want to run a poll real quick and see who kind of we have in the audience. So if you don't mind filling this out, that would be awesome. Cool. I will assume this is relatively proportionate to who we're going to get overall. I'm just going to read the results off before I end the poll in case it doesn't show up for everyone. But looks like we've got about 63% MBA students, 5% other students, 18% working professionals in the psychedelics industry, 10% working professionals, and 3% other. So cool. Thank you for filling that out. Okay, 5:05, so let's get started. Awesome. All right, thank you all for joining. Welcome to Business Trip. It's a panel on the business of psychedelics. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Daniel Tarakoff. I'm a first-year full-time MBA student at Berkeley Haas, and I'll be moderating the panel today. Really excited by all of the interest that we received. We had actually over 130 people register for the event. Obviously less in attendance, so time zones and all that can be tough, but still appreciate everyone that's here. Before I jump in, I want to give a quick shout out to our partners, the Haas Mindfulness Club, Healthcare Association, and the Haas Cannabis Club. Thanks for your support, and I see some faces in here, so thank you for joining. I have some awesome panelists today, and really excited to introduce you to them. Before I do that, a quick overview of the agenda for today. Going to spend the first 30 to 40 minutes going through a moderated panel. I'm going to ask some questions and hear the panelists' responses, but then at the end, save some time for an open Q&A. So as we're going through, if you have any questions, keep them in mind, put them in the chat, or save them for the end, and we'll take through those. Before I get to the panel, I know we have a mix of people, some who may be really familiar with the space, some who might be completely new to it. So I thought it would be cool to start just with an overview of some news that kind of came out and shows the momentum that the psychedelic space has seen over the past year. And so just going to read through kind of rapid fire some of what's happened last year and into the start of this year, just to give everyone kind of a sense of where we're at and ground us all in the same information. So it was a busy year, bear with me. January 2020, Santa Cruz voted to decriminalize psychedelics. They became the third US city to do so after Denver and Oakland. In March of last year, MindMed became the first psychedelic company to go public. In August, MAPS raised $30 million for their MDMA trials, and 4 patients in Canada were approved for psilocybin use in palliative care. It's the first time that's ever happened since the 1970s. In September, Compass Pathways IPO'd on the NASDAQ, and soon after, they became the first billion-dollar psychedelics company. And today, their market cap's a little bit over 1.5 billion. Ann Arbor also became the 4th city to decriminalize psychedelics. And very importantly, UC Berkeley launched their Center for Psychedelic Science. In November, Initiative 81 passed in DC, which decriminalized all entheogenic plants and fungi. And Measure 109 passed in Oregon, which I'm sure many have heard of or seen in the news, which decriminalized all drugs and set up a pathway for full legalization of psilocybin at the end of a 2-year development period. Atai Life Sciences announced the closing of a $125 million raise led by Peter Thiel. It was the largest private raise for a psychedelics company to date. They're expected to go public this year at a valuation north of $1 billion. In December, Small Pharma in UK got approval for the world's first DMT clinical trial for depression. And MAPS announced positive and statistically significant results for the first part of its MDMA phase 3 trials, moving to the second phase 3 study with the timeline of bringing MDMA to market by the first half of 2023. We saw more mainstream press. CNN's This Is Life with Lisa Ling aired an episode on psychedelic healing. And that brings us to 2021. And in the past 27 days, a lot has also happened. So Somerville, Massachusetts decriminalized psychedelics. So we're seeing some of that movement spread to the East Coast. The UFC president, Dana White, reached out to Johns Hopkins and is looking into psychedelics for traumatic brain injury. Mount Sinai launched their Center for Psychedelic Science. Yesterday, Atai Life Sciences announced a partnership with Massachusetts General Hospital, which is Harvard Medical School's main teaching hospital, for their new Center for the Neuroscience of Psychedelics. And finally, today, the first psychedelics ETF was launched. Began trading on the NEO exchange under the ticker symbol PSYK, PSYK, and contains 17 different companies that play in the space. So just wanted to start there to show people a lot of the movement that's happened. I think it's really exciting. 2020 was a really big year for the space, and I think 2021 will be even bigger. So with that, would love to jump to our panel and introduce them. I'm going to give a quick introduction for each of you, but then I'm going to go around and have you each kind of give a more thorough, in-depth introduction. So we have 4 awesome panelists today. Dr. Larissa Maier is a postdoc at UCSF. She's a member of the core research team of the Global Drug Survey, aiming to make drug use safer regardless of the legal status. And she also leads the Psychedelic and Entheogen Academic Council at UCSF. Fede Menapace, he's a former McKinsey consultant, a Stanford MBA, an entrepreneur, formerly a strategy consultant for the Psychedelic Science Funders Collaborative, and now serves as the director of strategy at MAPS. We have Jesse Hudson. He's an anthropologist. He has his JD from Tulane. He's now a venture partner and chief legal officer at Vine Ventures, an early stage VC fund focused on psychedelics. In full disclosure, he also happens to be my boss because I'm currently interning with them. And then finally, we've got Michael Hoyos. He's a Wharton undergrad and current MBA at Booth, has a background in a variety of roles in the financial services sector, and most recently serves as the co-founder and partner at the Conscious Fund in Americas, a psychedelic-focused VC as well. So thank you all for coming. Really excited to have you here. I think you guys all bring a unique sort of perspective to this conversation. So before I kind of jump into questions, would love to hear from each of you, what's been your path into the psychedelic space? Where are you at today? What are you working on? Kind of what's your current role? And maybe we can just tick in that same order. Larissa, if you want to kick us off.
Sure. Thank you so much, Daniel, for realizing that panel and inviting all of us here. I'm very happy to be kind of the research voice and maybe at some points later on also a bit of a critical voice related to the business side, because there are many approaches and many progress that has been made in the psychedelic research world. And it's great that we're changing the narrative and having these conversations really to help more people being able to access these medicines, or especially also plant-based medicines, to help with healing. But what form it takes, that's something we can discuss a bit later. My personal way, it was not really specific to psychedelics. I have been doing research on substance use and harm reduction for about 10 years by now. So my master thesis was about party drug prevention in the city of Zurich and the harms prevented from using drugs at parties. And we had several people who also ticked the boxes for the psychedelic drugs, but there were not so many. And of course, like in other party settings, stimulant drugs and also MDMA were commonly used, but more as part of a recreational drug use pattern. And very few people had experiences with psychedelic drugs beyond psilocybin and LSD. Some of them would list all of the analogs, and it was really interesting to see, but we didn't investigate that further. After that, my PhD was on substance use for cognitive enhancement. And in that perspective, I ran into people who were using psychedelics for cognitive enhancement, but that was very, very minor at the time. And again, most of the research focused on stimulants, prescription stimulants, and illicit stimulants. And for me, it was important to actually open up the range and show that other substances are also used for enhancement purposes. At the time, again, not medically, but based on self-explorations. By the time, more and more blogs and Reddit and people were sharing information online about the benefits. And very early on, I already knew that psychedelics will be very promising for mental health disorder treatment and generally dealing with mental health symptoms. But a lot of the concerns were like ethical, legal concerns that were not addressed at the time, and only few studies showed what can be done. In Switzerland, we actually had with Peter Gasser, a therapist who could prescribe drugs and has had very early on LSD for terminal ill patients. And because of following these and other studies, I always knew that this is something. And then with the Global Drug Survey, we picked up on these kind of substances more and more. And we asked people about their experiences with retreats, with self-exploration with psychedelics. And also right now, the Global Drug Survey 2021 is still online, so everyone on the call can take it. And we will have, again, a special module also on microdosing with LSD, psilocybin, and other compounds. So really keen to have your voices included in this year's survey. And again, to conclude, my last stop is here right now at the UCSF. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Department for Clinical Pharmacy, and I'm one of the leaders of the Psychedelic and Entheogen Academic Council at UCSF, where we hosted 30 events last year. It was a weekly meeting, and we will be back by the end of February with guests like Charles Rayson, Julie Holland, Katrin Preller, or Alex Belzer. So for anyone who's interested, please reach out. We do have the recordings available, and it has been wonderful to discuss so many of the different perspectives approaching psychedelic drugs and making sure that people have information and education as we move forward with the progress regarding these substances.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Larissa. Fede?
Thanks, Daniel and Larissa. So happy to have you here with your wealth of knowledge in research in the field. As the director of strategy at MAPS, I work with our leadership and our allies to envision our long-term strategy for the organization, and then identify the key initiatives and operating plans to working towards achieving that strategy. Over the course of the last year at MAPS, I've worked on our capstone campaign that you mentioned earlier. I'm now working with our team on our European raise. So it's another $30 million raise to fund approval with the EMA, the European Medicines Agency. I also work with our team that writes the grants to foundations for fundraising purposes, as well as working on the global regulatory approval plan for the organization. I also work with the team at MAPS to develop our health equity program, which is a set of initiatives to ensure that we can have equitable access to psychedelic assisted therapy. MAPS, for those of you who would like more information, is a nonprofit organization that was founded in 1986 with the purpose of doing research and education around developing medical, legal, and cultural context for people to benefit from the safe use of psychedelics and marijuana. And I would say that the mission of MAPS is mass mental health, and that's I think well captured in one of our 7 principles, healing for all. MAPS specifically has been developing MDMA-assisted therapy for the treatment of PTSD through FDA regulated trials. We're now, as you mentioned, Daniel, in phase 3. We're doing the last confirmatory study. If that is successful, we will have been able to legalize MDMA-assisted therapy. PTSD is a big problem in the US and worldwide. More than 8 million people suffering from PTSD in the US only. We see that the primary causes of PTSD in the population that we are currently treating through our trials is sexual abuse and the PTSD from war. More than 350 million people worldwide also suffer from PTSD. So while we're focused on FDA approval as our first milestone, we're also already working with the European Medicines Agency, and we actually have our first trials in Europe underway at the moment. Because worldwide, once FDA and EMA provide approval, most of the other regulatory agencies in the world will follow that. And so one of our top priorities is ensuring that access is available worldwide as soon as possible.
Awesome work. Jesse, you want to take it next?
Sure. Thanks, Daniel, for having us. And you said I'm the boss, but really you're the boss today. So I'll follow your instructions here. You asked, what's the path to now? And it started in 2005, about 15 years ago, when a friend in a dorm room said, Trey Anastasio says, take DMT and trip to another world. And I said, what the fuck are you talking about? Who's Trey Anastasio? What's DMT? And I went and Googled both of those things, found the band Fish and this Arrowhead page for the substance DMT, which contains trip reports, raw narratives from people who've experienced the psychedelic and wrote about it. And as a kid growing up on a diet of literature and mainly fantasy books like Wheel of Time and Lord of the Rings, the stuff that I was reading read like nonfiction as fiction. It read like something that bled over into the fantasy world. And so I was riveted by the information and got my hands on as much as I could related to the psychedelic experience, related to what people were experiencing in these altered states. And I found that the best books were written by anthropologists who were going into indigenous communities where these ethnobotanical entheogens were used most widely and for the longest amount of time. And so dedicated my university career at the University of Colorado in Boulder to anthropology and to the study of a particular entheogen named ayahuasca. Because ayahuasca, unlike psilocybin or cactus, contains two different plants that together present a pharmaceutical technology that is exceedingly fascinating. And Vine Ventures is named after that vine, the Banisteriopsis caapi vine that provides the key ingredient in ayahuasca that inhibits an enzyme called monoamine oxidase that breaks down neurotransmitters in the body, such as DMT, which the other plant contains. And so that riddle of this pharmaceutical innovation and the riddle of what was happening to people in these DMT experiences and these experiences with psychedelics drove me into this academic fascination with the subject. And that carried over into my legal career, where I focused on indigenous rights and indigenous cultures and international development, and then ended up getting a job as a capital markets lawyer. And very far from that, while working nonprofit involved with psychedelic organizations. And those two worlds met, the world of capital markets law, funds, trading, commodities trading, and the world of nonprofit involvement in psychedelics at the creation of Vine, which was born out of a conference called Breaking Convention, where I was presenting a paper I've written on the legal framework for ayahuasca use in the United States, where there's this new proliferation, as I'm sure you've seen, of ayahuasca using churches, which replaced the traditional placebo Eucharist with a very powerful substance called ayahuasca. And through that, have a very deep mystical religious experience. And so I analyzed that. And after that, the founder of Vine, Ryan Zur, a venture capitalist who founded a very successful crypto fund called Polychain, asked me to join Vine. And so where I am today is at Vine Ventures as chief legal officer, but also as a venture partner, and also as what I consider to be a bit of a moral compass, focusing on this historical grounding of psychedelics in the world of nonprofits, in the world of indigenous peoples, and in the world of this deep research on the academic side of things that I think pokes holes at a lot of the various generalizations that people have, like, oh, this will be a medicalization only industry, or oh, this will be one thing or another. Because anthropology teaches us to question those generalizations, to decolonize that thought process. And what we're working on at Vine that I think you might find interesting and we can get into later is exploring unique business models within this sector of what we could so call niche life sciences, but what I think might be better termed as both psychedelic science and psychedelic culture. And so that's where we are, and very happy to be here. Thanks, Daniel and Fede and Michael and the rest of the panelists, and looking forward to getting in this conversation.
Thanks, Jesse. You brought up a lot of pieces that we will definitely dive into a little bit down the road. So Michael, I will give it to you first.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. We're happy to be here and very grateful that Jesse went before me because he actually was able to describe a lot of stuff that'll save me a little time as far as ayahuasca experience goes. So that's actually what led me to this. So my path to this was basically early in my career, I was working at a big New York City bank, and I had an opportunity to go back to Miami, which is where I grew up, and I was helping build a private equity firm pretty early in my career. It was a pretty awesome opportunity, and I'm here thinking I'm on top of the world, like I'm the hottest shit on earth. And then I got invited to an ayahuasca ceremony by a big family office that was a big client of ours. And I was very close with the family, and they asked me to go, and I said, all right, sure, not really knowing what I was signing myself up for. And I went, and as Jesse just very colorfully described, I mean, it was extremely impactful. I consider it the most significant thing I've ever done. It's the most humbling thing I've ever done. And it really put into perspective, my entire life and really what I was doing with it, right? So following that experience, I decided to transition out of that role, and I spent some time building an advisory business where I was working with similar sort of, wealthy clients in an advisory capacity, partly integrating that experience and partly starting to make business plans for what I wanted to do longer term. That experience stayed with me it's still with me. And then it kind of segued into very serendipitously into what I'm doing now. I was looking into business school basically to have this opportunity to make those business plans. I started seeing where this was going to become an actual industry, and I wanted to be a part of it early on to help guide it in the right direction. And I don't know if you guys have seen that episode of Billions in the first episode of season 5, where a hedge fund manager goes and does an ayahuasca ceremony. It's a terrible depiction of an ayahuasca ceremony, but afterwards he's like, all right, how do we invest in this? And it's just kind of like the personification of just the worst possible people to get involved with this. So I kind of wanted to get involved to, hopefully help guide things in a better direction. So that led me to connecting with my partners based out of the UK, and the Conscious Fund was just starting to take shape. And I had built a private investment business before in Miami, obviously a very different private investment business, but all the kind of same sort of core competencies go into building this sort of business. So it was just kind of the right meeting at the right time, and we've been kind of running with it ever since. And so what we focus on early stage venture capital, primarily seed and Series A investments, and we're pretty agnostic in terms of what the businesses are involved with, as long as it's in the, call it, psychedelic space or adjacent space. In addition to external investments, we also incubate businesses. So things maybe similar to what Jesse was talking about, looking for creative, innovative sort of business concepts and helping grow those businesses in-house. One of our most successful ones is Microdose, which is a media and events platform. If you go to microdose.buzz, you can get tickets to our monthly investor conference where we have companies, entrepreneurs, different sorts of investors come speak once a month. We've had Rick Doblin from Maps headline, the CEOs of all the top companies speak, then all other sorts of programming. And then we look to add value in other ways. So we helped start the Psychedelic Medicine Association as the first sort of professional medical association of its kind, and started the first industry jobs board, and other sort of similar value add things for the space, is trying to help it grow and take shape.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And I can attest to the microdose events. They're really great. Definitely check those out. Great. I've got a lot of questions, so let's dive in. I want to start just at an introductory level so that we all understand what we're talking about, because we hear the word psychedelics, but it's really quite a lot of different types of medicines. And so, Larissa, I'm wondering if I can direct this to you, given your work and what you've seen. What kind of just are the different psychedelics that we're talking about here? And I know we talked about some of them, like MDMA being used for PTSD, but what are some of the other use cases that these psychedelic medicines can help heal or help people manage their symptoms with?
All right. Yeah, it's a good question because depending on the group or team, there are many different definitions, and the classical psychedelics, mainly the hallucinogenics like LSD, psilocybin, ayahuasca, or ibogaine, are sometimes deferred or handled separately from, for example, MDMA and ketamine, because they have different compounds and definitely like different neurosynthesis and neuroplasticity. But with regard to the MDMA assisted therapy, we can really say that this is mainly like effective for PTSD. And again, not for everyone. There are many, many exclusions, and all the studies that are currently conducted have exclusion criteria that some of the mental health disorders cannot be included. So that there are always limitations, and we have to be very clear that even if a study or the phase 3 trials show that there is efficacy, there are always people who will not benefit from the treatment. So it's all about also keeping the expectations low. But when we move forward, ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, for example, is already legal in some countries, like in the United States, and some therapists are licensed to provide that therapy, again, with very good results. And importantly, there are some trials where people are also receiving the medication repeatedly. And when we look at the classical psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin, we really see that just one treatment with the substance-based or integrated in psychotherapy can be a meaningful change or can be the relief from symptoms. The same is true when we look at ibogaine for substance use disorder treatment. Also of opioid use disorder, it's very promising. But again, we don't have enough research to fully state that it's effective for all of these indications. Psilocybin, for example, has shown very promising results with nicotine use disorder or just nicotine dependence, where really this medication was, or the psychotherapy with the medication was much than other ending smoking tools. So it's very promising there. But again, these are single studies, and some of the researchers are still a bit hesitant to overgeneralize the results, and that's totally fair. But when we look at the safety of the substances, then we can say that even the FDA has told that, for example, psilocybin and MDMA are breakthrough therapies, and so they're focusing on it, and we are awaiting the trials, basically those from MAPS and other organizations that have been involved with these trials for a while. And it's a very interesting space to watch. We don't have the final conclusions yet, but we can say that some of these compounds seem to be very effective. And that's also what businesses play with when they want to patent the different compounds for their personal use.
Awesome, really appreciate that overview. And Fede, I'm curious from you, given kind of your involvement with MAPS, and MAPS is an organization, right, that's been doing a lot of this work in the background for decades, really. Why do you think we're seeing this resurgence now in psychedelics? A lot of this stuff has been underground, again, going on for decades, but almost what feels like all of a sudden there's just this huge boom of interest and regulatory movement. Why do you think that's happening?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So the first thing that I'll say to that is that there's been a lot of work going on since psychedelics were made illegal, and then MDMA was made illegal in the 80s. Sort of like a lot of groundwork to make progress, to even get the FDA to agree to conduct studies. So it took about 10 years between MAPS founding and when the FDA agreed to have some studies, and then it was an early collaboration with Charlie Grove at UCLA that led to the first study. And then that spawned both MAPS' MDMA research and the psilocybin research for end-of-life anxiety and terminal illness. And so it took a while to have the first studies and the first results and the first indication and the first clarity that the substances were safe. So I guess we've gotten to a point where now we're seeing the hockey stick growth that maybe we're familiar with when it comes to the tech industry, because we are at a point where we're getting close enough to commercialization that a lot of the interest is now coming alive. I would say to show what the economic impact of this type of research can be, I'd like to talk a little bit about the approach that MAPS took, being a nonprofit organization. And so the psychedelic field here is showing us that it's actually possible to adopt an approach to pharma development that's not the typical that we see. The law and the regulation allows an organization like MAPS, once they complete the clinical trials and obtain FDA approval, to actually enjoy a period of time called exclusivity period, where MAPS is going to be the only organization that can sell MDMA to therapists for providing this treatment. This period can last somewhere between 5 and 6 years in the US, and then it can be extended for more indications. So imagine after we get approval for PTSD, we can get it for anxiety disorders, eating disorders, and others. And then regulatory approval in Europe will also extend it in that geography. So even a nonprofit organization like MAPS stands to earn hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, actually, from developing this drug in this manner. And so once the hurdles of regulatory approval were surpassed and we got past phase 2 and begin to do phase 3, then I think a lot of organizations in the space, Compass was the first one, realized that there was a clear path. And so it was almost like a lot of work to open the way. And then once the way was open, it was possible for other organizations, nonprofit and for-profit, to continue to work. I also want to call out USONA Institute that has been doing a lot of great work in developing psilocybin therapy for major depressive disorder. And I wonder if I can also kind of plug in a topic of discussion here with respect to both nonprofit and for-profit existing in the space, and how can for-profit set themselves up to make money when there are nonprofits that could also obtain regulatory approval and then kind of be in this counterbalancing force. So when for-profit organizations seek protection via IP and patents, what does that say about future intentions with respect to allowing or not allowing other nonprofit organizations to bring such treatments to market?
Yeah, I think it's a great topic for discussion, and it's somewhat in the realm of what my next question was also going to be, but that was around kind of getting into public benefit corporations and why we're seeing those kind of structures pop up as well, and just in general what that kind of role of nonprofits and for-profits is going to be in the future of the space. Jesse, you've got your legal background. Can you give us a rundown of kind of like what a public benefit corp is? And if you have a response to kind of Fede's question, we'd love to hear it as well.
Sure. A public benefit corporation is part of a newer crop of companies that has emerged since 2006, when Muhammad Yunus gave his economic Nobel Peace Prize winning, or Nobel Prize in Economics winning speech on social enterprise for his work on microcredit systems in northern Bangladesh among women entrepreneurs at Grameen Bank. And what he said in that speech that set off this whole Cambrian explosion of new corporate forms, including the PBC, was that to make capitalism work for the 21st century, we have to redefine the word as kind of making money solving social problems. And that gave rise to this idea of social enterprise. And that gave rise to the idea of a PBC. The first PBC, Public Benefit Corporation, law was passed in Delaware. And what it says is essentially that in the certificate of formation of the organization, a special purpose needs to be designated, a special social purpose needs to be designated, which can be as simple as healing minds at home. which is what Virgil's VR-based psychedelic breathwork and ultimately psychedelic therapy organization has as its special purpose. Now, the key thing about this special purpose is that every other year at least, the PBC has to report to its shareholders what it's done to try to achieve that special purpose. And if it fails to deliver that report, then there's a shareholder derivative action that is kind of a sword of Damocles hanging over the organization, making sure it's on its good behavior. So if the PBC, for example, fails to heal minds at home or fails to achieve that public benefit, the shareholders can then sue to make sure that it rights the ship. Now, in the case of MAPS, that sort of Damocles is not available, right? Because MAPS PBC is wholly owned by MAPS 501c3. So there is no outside shareholder who's able to hold the PBC accountable through that accountability mechanism designed into the corporate format. But I think nevertheless, it's a very interesting organization, and the use of the PBC in itself is gaining a lot of momentum throughout the psychedelic sector, not only in MAPS, but also Virgil's, and also Maier Health, which is a software company. I think with all of those, you're going to see more and more socially responsible investors feeling comfortable investing in these companies because they know that there's this accountability mechanism that reduces the focus on profit primacy and increases focus on what Muhammad Yunus called making money solving social problems, this new form of capitalism that we engage in the 21st century world.
Yeah, I quickly, thanks, Jesse. This was very informative. I'd also add that last week, the first publicly traded company in the United States became a PBC, that is Viva Systems. It's a software company that provides solutions for pharma development organizations. So I think it's very exciting that we're starting to see this type of momentum even outside of the psychedelics field. And I think ultimately what we hope to move towards is a place in a market where returns to shareholders are not the most important thing, and are not the legally binding thing that organizations need to do when they're performing their business.
Mm-hmm. The issue is that shareholder derivative lawsuit that is the sword of Damocles above the PBC is, in my opinion, the key accountability mechanism that the PBC intended to create. And so that's why I think it's important to focus on when one focuses on the PBC. Otherwise, you can have a third-party certification scheme like the B Corporation scheme, which is ultimately not necessarily a system of direct accountability to shareholders who have ultimately the primary power in a capitalist system, but rather to this third-party organization.
Got it. Thanks, Jesse. I want to come back to this too, and a little bit later on, if the PBC structure or the B Corp structure, if those are enough in addressing some of the concerns that the community has with the commercialization of psychedelics. But before we do that, maybe let's talk about, the big evil companies. Just kidding, they're not all evil. Michael, maybe we could turn to you. I'm curious a few things. One is if you could just give an overview of maybe some of the real big players that we're seeing in the psychedelic space. And secondly, given that you've been working with a lot of these companies and helping fund them, what are some of the big challenges that they're facing as they're trying to build a company in this kind of new emerging industry?
Sure. And I think it'd be helpful to just provide a little context as to what, when you say psychedelic medicine industry, what we're actually talking about. So I would think about it almost in three big buckets or primary buckets. One would be around drug development, drug design development. The second bucket would be clinics and outpatient centers. So you could think of the first one as almost like manufacturing, and the second one is distribution. And then a third kind of catch-all bucket that you could think of as ancillary businesses. So any sort of support subsector or business that provides some sort of support to one and two. So things in that bucket would include different sort of technology companies. So there's artificial intelligence companies, for example. We just made an investment in one that's doing artificial intelligence for drug discovery. You have things like digital therapeutics there, medical devices potentially, media, general software. Especially in this space, a lot of database software that folks are working on. So it's broader than just, people think of the pharmaceutical aspect, but it's broader than just that. In terms of some of the big companies, so the one that most people are very aware of now is Compass. I think you mentioned their IPO, so they had the biggest IPO of any company. They raised over $140 million, and on the first day of trading, we're up 70%. So they were the first billion-dollar psychedelic company, and their market cap's approaching $2 billion now. After that, a lot of people got really excited. There are already a few publicly traded ones. Some notable ones include Numinous, Cybin. Both of those are in TCS portfolio. You have Field Trip. They're based out of Canada. They're doing clinics, but they're also doing some drug development work as well. You have Bexon Biomedical. They're working on subcutaneous ketamine formulations for pain management. MindMed is actually the first publicly listed psychedelic company. They're working on drug development as well. So right now, most of the companies that have gone public or the really big ones, I mean, when I say really big, like the really big ones are Compass and I guess MindMed is probably number 2 right now in the kind of $1 billion range, but you have several companies that are in the $100-200 million market cap, and a lot of companies that are going public now that are small cap or micro cap that are going public in places like Canada and the TSXV. So you're seeing a lot of capital market activity with those sorts of companies as well. And what was the last part of your question?
Yeah, the second part was, based on the companies you've worked with, either your portfolio companies or the companies you're meeting with. What are the challenges?
So I think a lot of the initial challenges were sort of probably some of the same challenges that organizations like MAPS and a lot of the nonprofits face when they're doing initial fundraising, and even now, or probably Jesse, can testify to this as well. Like when you're dealing with investors, when I deal with investors as an investment firm, or when the companies deal with investors, as companies, the first big part, or the first huge hurdle you have to deal with is just education. So even folks that maybe have had a psychedelic experience before, they have no clue as far as how far along this has come as a space, both in terms of research and as an industry, right? So it's just a huge hurdle at the beginning, just in terms of education, right? And once you educate them, then it's kind of making the value proposition or making the case of, like now is the right time, right? So that's probably, I'd say that's probably one of the biggest hurdles. And then the second hurdle is just kind of, for the companies that are doing drug discovery, I mean, that's just a difficult business regardless of what you're focusing on, right? So you have the added layer of this being like, call it sort of, I guess, a niche and in an area that's been taboo for a long time. So probably just kind of, it makes it so you're playing the game in like extra difficult mode, right? But you're starting to see that narrative change a lot, and it's becoming a lot more mainstream just in terms of conversations you have with folks. I have conversations with people about this all the time, obviously, and just the randomest people you never expect to know anything about this, or just coming at me with a million questions and are super interested. You mentioned the Lisa Ling CNN special, which came out in December. I was actually bedridden with COVID when it came out, so I was able to actually watch the whole thing. But it's amazing that those sorts of things are becoming so commonplace, and you're seeing them all the time. I remember even just a year ago, the idea of Berkeley hosting this sort of event is, not insane, but like kind of like, oh, okay, like that's extremely random. Now it's like, oh yeah, obviously they would do that. Like it makes total sense. And you're seeing that all over the place now. So I suspect that a lot of these initial hurdles are going to start becoming less troublesome. Almost like at an inflection point.
Thank you. I want to make sure I do save a little bit of time for questions, but I have a few more I want to get through. So I'm just going to do like a rapid fire because I'd love all of your guys' thoughts on this one. Do you think that the psychedelic space in the future is going to be a medical path only, or do you also see a recreational path? And maybe Larissa, I could start with you just quickly, kind of what your thoughts are there.
Well, here my thoughts are very clear. I hope it's not only a medical path. I think if it's going to be that direction, that could destroy a lot of the benefits we could have, because there is community healing happening. Trip sitters don't necessarily need a special education, and a lot of the psychedelic plant-based available in nature and have been used like extensively. And to be short, the most important thing about psychedelics is really drug set and setting. And the medical setting or a research lab is definitely not the right setting for many people to have a good and beneficial psychedelic experience, especially communities that have been discriminated against in the United States, Black communities. They don't trust the medical system, and they will not be able to access the services if we provide them. So be mindful and also make space for community healing and for recreational use, which can be increasing or even preventing mental health symptoms.
Thank you. Fede, what about you? What do you think?
Yes, so I mean, currently millions of people every year have psychedelic experiences, and almost 0% can do it in a medical setting because there's only clinical trials. After all these approvals, still a very small percentage of all psychedelic use will be in the doctor's office, and the vast majority will happen outside. And so I think we need to kind of look at this trend and focus on what is important to do so that the introduction and the mainstreaming of psychedelics into society happens in a safe way. One of the things that we do at MAPS that's really important is the education and the harm reduction work. And so Zendo is a project that we have at MAPS to help educate people on how to take care of other people that are taking psychedelics and take care of themselves. So harm reduction, education are critical. And in the words of Bob Jesse, an elder in the space that has been behind a lot of the work that's happened, we're psychedelics for the betterment of well people is what this conversation is about. So of course, we started with addressing very critical issues of people that are struggling with disease. And after we deal with that, and then we have to think about how to build a world where psychedelics used in society can happen in a safe and sustainable way.
Thank you. Michael, what do you think?
I think that if history is any indicator, like we definitely shouldn't rush into recreational phase. I think starting with a medical, like a medical only sort of framework, and allowing us enough time to really develop protocols and develop the infrastructure that would allow people to do this recreationally. Because I do believe that there's obviously a ton of applications medically, right? The three big buckets being mental health, addiction, and pain management. But I think the real big potential, what really gets me excited, and the real reason I'm doing this kind of long term, is that it has incredible potential to help people become just better people, right? Personal growth and empathy, I think, are huge. I think these substances have huge potential for that. So, I definitely do envision a world where you can do this recreationally or beyond just to treat a specific medical indication. But I think we need to develop infrastructure around that. I don't think we're ready to just hand people, substances and say, hey, good luck. I think we need to give people a little bit more guidance in that, and we need a little bit of time to get there.
Thanks, Michael. And Jesse.
So I come from this kind of from an anthropology perspective. And in that, there's a quote I'd like to share with you, and then a point after the quote. It comes from a book by Wade Davis, who's an anthropologist and a National Geographic explorer in residence. And it's a book where he traces the father of modern ethnobotany, Richard Evans Schultes, his 12 interrupted years in the Amazon. And Schultes asked a shaman, how often do you drink yahe, which is ayahuasca? And the shaman's response suggested the question had no meaning. During illness, of course, and in the wake of death, sometimes in need or in hardship. It's certain passages in life. When a young boy has his first haircut, he drinks it. And when he kills for the first time, he drinks it too. And naturally, the shaman suggested a young person may drink at leisure to improve hunting technique or simply to flaunt physical prowess. The message that Schultes received was that the Kofan took Yahe whenever they felt like it, at least once a week, and no doubt on any occasion that warranted it. So I think if you look at the long story arc of the use of psychedelics, you'll find that there's a very diverse use set that isn't just medical, it's often isn't just recreational. For example, in the wake of death. And that brings up this core point that I think bears repeating now, especially more than ever. On the back of a new New York Times bestseller called The Immortality Key by an attorney named Brian Murescu, was in the capital markets division of Milbank Tweed on Wall Street for 12 years, previously a classic scholar at Brown. And what he postulates is that the emergence of psychedelics is part of a new reformation, a religious reformation. And that if you look back through history, the main use modality for psychedelics has been this religious use, even back to the ancient Greeks using it at Eleusis. And if you look at indigenous cultures where religion and medicine often meld together, there is this spiritual component to it. And even today, if you look around at the main use modality for psychedelics, most people are kind of using them in these quasi-spiritual circles, some ayahuasca circles, whether informal or formal. And if you take a psychedelic or you read about narratives on Erowid or elsewhere, you'll find that spiritual and religious language is there because it scratches at something ineffable and brings in a little bit of transcendence into the experience of the user. And so I dare say that the main use modality in the future may be the same as the main use modality that it has been throughout history, which is in a religious setting.
Very cool. Thank you all. I have like 20 more questions, but I want to open it up to the audience in our last 5 minutes if there are any other questions that are coming from there. Otherwise, I will keep talking. But if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand and I'll call on you. See one from Andrew Shane. You want to take it away?
Sure. Hey, everyone. This is really helpful and interesting. Thank you so much for the time. I tried to take notes on everything that was being said, but one thing that I lost track of was you guys mentioned a bunch of publicly traded companies that are touching the space, which I think is really interesting for people who want to access the space but don't work in it directly, just to track kind of what's going on, how companies are existing today in a public sphere, kind of tracking news, et cetera. So I'd be really interested in, maybe Daniel, this could be a question for you, but kind of getting a download of those companies that were mentioned today, just so those of us that are interested in tracking them can continue to kind of follow along the industry, because there were so many that were named that I'd never heard of before. I thought that was a really interesting element of the call.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll share a recording after this, so you can go back and listen if you'd like, but a couple of resources I might point you to. Psilocybin Alpha is a good website that tracks all of these companies. You can see all of the public companies, as well as I believe some private companies to kind of track those. And another good place to start would be looking up that psychedelic ETF that just launched today. It includes 17 companies, some of which just kind of dabble in the psychedelic space, like Johnson & Johnson with their esketamine product, but others like Compass and MindMed that are fully kind of committed to the psychedelic side. And I see we've got a couple more resources being added to the chat. Awesome, thanks for your question. Jen, you wanna take it away?
Yeah, sure, thanks. So I'm just curious how you all think this is gonna play out, let's say, when MDMA or psilocybin, well, psilocybin's already going to be legal in Oregon, and Florida just introduced a bill similar to Oregon's. But like, okay, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is legal, then what? Like, you can use it off label, like how much flexibility is there with the protocol in terms of how that ultimately impacts access, and whether, you know, if I'm just a healthy, normal person, will I be able to access MDMA-assisted psychotherapy in an off-label capacity, and what discussion in the field there is around that.
Who wants to take that one?
I can probably speak a little bit to the MDMA piece, Jen. Thank you. That's a great question. This is not something that's fully clear yet. So the way that the regulatory approval of MDMA therapy works is that there's a negotiation with the FDA on what the treatment protocol needs to look like. Before practitioners can provide this treatment, they have to adhere to the REMS that are called the risk evaluation and mitigation strategies, which will get clarified a little bit better later in time. It doesn't seem to me like off-label prescription would be possible right off the bat. I think that might have to go through additional indications and potentially lack of REMS in the future. But I actually would like to stop here because I know there's other knowledge in the panel that might be able to weigh in.
Anyone else want to
Do
pick
you
it
know
up?
anything about this?
Sure. So there's off-label ketamine use, and Jen, you might have mentioned that in your question, and forgive me if you did, but that is relatively widely available. And I sit on the board of an organization called Sage Institute in Oakland, and they're focused on access to psychedelic therapies for underserved communities, and part of that access is off-label ketamine use, and I think what you can find in the proliferation of ketamine clinics is a willingness to accept that anxiety and depression, which are arguably suffered by everyone, especially in this time of COVID and post-COVID world, are valid for a ketamine prescription, and therefore valid reasons to engage in psychedelic assisted therapy. But if you're a totally healthy, functioning individual with no anxieties and no depressions, I don't think that there's a possibility to access, at least in a clinical setting, psychedelic assisted therapy. That said, in these religious settings or quasi-religious settings where people are having psychedelic circles protected by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, you may very much be able to access a similar style experience. Although you don't necessarily have a therapist, you have somebody who may call themselves a shaman.
Yeah, I just want to briefly pick up on that as well and say, like, generally, I don't think that these kind of availability of psychedelic medicines in a therapeutic setting will make a big difference. There are still people who will never try and other people who are ready to try. So for them, it's amazing. But what it will do, like the whole discussion and more media attention to it, is that more and more people will try on their own. And while Michael said we need to wait with recreational use and everything and making it available, we know that with every drug that we don't have regulated access to, as long as there is no drug checking available, we don't know what we're taking. So people will always rely on the information of the consider themselves shamans outside of the space because they will continue to exist. And so it's on us that we have like a responsibility to create safe spaces where people can have these experiences and enough education for those people who will nevertheless continue going on to try on their own.
Thank you. Thank you all. I know we're over time, so I'm going to wrap it up. I have a whole bunch of questions that I wasn't able to get to, which just means I'm going to have another event later down the road, but really appreciate all of you joining. It was a great start to the conversation and loved all of the input that you brought. So yeah, thanks again. And yeah, hopefully we can connect again soon.
Thanks, Daniel. Thank you all.
Awesome. Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Daniel.